Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and it's time for us to take a look at this free agency class. We're going to discuss some of the salary cap ramifications, what players are going to cost, give some thoughts on these guys again. We did this on Monday. Some of it, we hadn't been introduced to these players yet. They're guys that some of them were hearing their names for the first time. I know for me, Robert Hainsey would be an example of that. Eric Murray, even players like that. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily bad, but sometimes you're not familiar with players, and so it's good to have some time to take a look at this. And as well, we didn't go super in depth in a lot of those videos because I was sick on that day. I had to stop recording before the Hainsey signing, and haven't done anything this week because I've been just trying to get my voice back, and I know you guys don't like listening to the coughing and all that. So we tried to get through Monday the best we could. Apologize for all that. But I think we are pretty well in the clear now. So should be good going forward. Now, we'll jump into this. We're going to go kind of player by player again. We're going to also talk about, where are they at spending-wise? Is there really room to make more moves? And what does this roster really need to take it to the next level? Because that is a big question for me here. And are we just shooting to be an average team? Or what do we need to do with the rest of this offseason to really give ourselves some star power on this team? So starting off with Dyami Brown here, he's the biggest cap hit of all these players this year because he's on a one-year deal. You're not going to have anything prorated. Something very notable that they did with all these contracts, you do not have players who are playing on void years, taking contracts with void years. So they are not doing the crazy, Trent Baalke void year contracts where, guys will have cap hits for 6 years on a 3-year deal and things like that. And so you're not going to see super small numbers every year, but you are getting money out of the way. And that is the good side of it, right? You're paying now, you're not going to have to pay later. We already see some players this year, Brandon Scherf, Mitch Morse. Those are two examples of guys that they still have cap hits for this team, even though they are not on the team or they've retired. And so that's part of what happens when you prorate so much money, when you have void years and you do all those things. Now, starting with Dyami Brown, we're going to get into him. I think this was an upside signing for the Jaguars. I think for me, what I have to understand, my evaluation is that, $10 million looks bad for a player who has not had any really big seasons in the NFL. The wide receiver market has gone crazy since then. Or since, really the last time I reevaluated what players should be worth. $10 million isn't even a fourth of what the top contract's going to be at the position once Jamar Chase gets paid. And that might happen by the time you watch this video. Because, we'll have to see. Apparently, they're close to a contract, and T. Higgins is, so that dream's going to officially die here sometime soon, unfortunately. But Dyami Brown, what's interesting about him and appealing for the Jaguars is the playoff performance. It's the way that he ended things. You also heard James Gladstone talk a bit about how he actually had a really good evaluation on Brown in that draft class. He basically said he was a really damn good deep threat with the potential to grow into more. So I think the way they're looking at this is, hey, 1-year deal. We're not paying a crazy amount of money to the position. We don't have to pay Brian Thomas Jr. right now. We're getting a player who was really good in the playoffs, in the big games. Can we find a way to use him in the same regard that they did, or maybe build on that to where this is more consistent, and then Brown is coming out here and he's performing at a high level all season long. You also think at the same time, the deep threat element that he's going to bring to the Jaguars goes into what Trevor Lawrence is good at and what he did a lot of in college, where he is able to uncork that ball, get down the field, and this team needs to threaten. in that regard, right? And there's some stats last year that show that they tried to, but they have to be better about it. And getting players like Brown, who are really fast, going to be able to run by the defense, gives you another threat opposite of Brian Thomas Jr. It's really good for this offense. And so it is a risk in some regard because this is not some proven player. But at the same time, I do think they're going to get more out of him. And I think he will live up to this contract. And I do think that at the end of the day, I would say it's a good signing for the Jaguars. Are there other directions they could have gone? Is there maybe other players that I would prefer to get? Sure. I know some people are kind of changing their mind on Cooper Kupp now because, well, he went to Seattle and he's got paid $15 million, and some people think that's too much. I don't think that would have been bad for this team. I would have been all over that personally. But I have no problem with this move. Understanding the potential here, how they feel about him, it helps out your wide receiver room. What is interesting as well is looking at the depth chart here. I had a hard time really figuring this out because you don't really have a slot player for this team. Of your three realistic starters, who are probably Brian Thomas Jr., Dyami Brown, and Gabe Davis. Parker Washington is going to be out there too, but he's also played a lot outside. So you have four players, essentially, who are more of outside guys. So it's going to be interesting. I think they're going to move everyone into the slot a bit, and that's going to be a role that every player is going to have some part in for this team. Now, Patrick Mekari, we'll talk about him. He's an interesting one to me. Not someone I was a super big fan of as far as all these signings they made. I like the versatility. That is really good to see. My concern is going to be what he does overall. You know, outside of pass protection a little bit here, but what is he as a run blocker? You have one good year here. You have most years not really getting graded good at all. You have a lot of penalties from this last year. There were some plays I saw getting shared around from games where he looked like a liability at times. I think that's probably cherry picked, to be honest. I'm not going to sit here and say he's a liability all the time. This is someone they trust a lot. This is someone who played in a lot of roles. There is absolutely value here. I just question if this is going to be a shift from necessarily the guys who are good pass blockers, but maybe not as much in the run game, to now trying to get a more balanced offensive line. I have some concerns about that because I don't think Mekari really fits that bill of let's bring in like a guy who's going to maul in the run game. Someone's going to get movement. I don't know if that's really what he does. So that's kind of my concern here for that signing. Now, we'll talk about Robert Hainsey while we're here, and probably Chuma Edoga as well, just for a moment, which he's not one we're going to talk about too much since he is a backup on this team. Not a lot to talk about throughout his time. With Hainsey, something that Gladstone had said, I think it was Gladstone specifically, was that they went and watched specifically the one game last year that he started for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And obviously Liam Cohen got to see that. He was there coaching the offense. And it's a great performance for PFF, but they said on the film that really stood out to them, and it showed a guy who knew he was auditioning for a future job, who gave it everything he had, who was good on the field. And the Jaguars, with this move, they're taking a shot on a player that it's not going to cost them a lot, right? It's like, I think $7 million a year for Hainsey, and you got 3 years of that. And you could get someone who, if he's able to keep this up as a starter, it's going to be a really good contract for the Jaguars. So this is a really good shot for them in free agency. I think considering all the players that were available, the options they had, just it wasn't a player I knew necessarily, but knowing the context, how they feel about him, what they're paying him, I think this could be a really good move for them and work out very well for them in the long run. Now, we'll talk just for a moment about Chuma Edoga, kind of go through his career. She has not played a ton of games Williams. And I know I probably said his name wrong. Like, I feel like we do with a lot of these players. He has been around for 6 years. He has played 1,457 snaps. That's about like a year and a half of play in that time. Most snaps he's had in a year was in 2023 with Dallas. He played nearly half the season. Just someone, I think it's your typical stuff you see from backups, especially with grades. Here, you'll have some good performances. You also have some stinkers. You'll have them go against guys they're not really prepared against. And, you want that consistency. You can't have necessarily starters that are going out there and not playing at that high level all the time. That can be a concern. This is a player this is the expectation, right? He is a backup. He's been that throughout his career. He's been fine at it. And he gives you what is ultimately much needed depth at the position. And am I going to knock that? I don't think so, right? I mean, you look at the contract, this is fine. $3.5 million for a backup at the position, it's important. We need to bring in guys there, especially with Walker Little having injuries throughout his career. That is something to keep an eye on. Hoping he stays healthy this next season. Now, Jordan Lewis, we'll move there. This was one of the biggest signings they made, the first one of free agency. It was an interesting one because we were wondering where he's going to fit in, or more so, where's that going to put Jarion Jones? What it sounds like is that Lewis is going to be the slot. Jarion's going to get a chance outside. I don't know if necessarily anyone else is going to be brought in to compete with him. That could be the case. For example, if Travis Hunter was there at 5, they're going to sprint in the card to the podium. So it is possible that a player comes in to compete with Jarion. But Jordan Lewis, he is a guy who was very revered by that Cowboys locker room, by people in that organization. You love to see that. Had a great coverage grade as well last year. Super competitive player. He is going to bring a mentality to that defense. He's going to bring leadership to that defense. And that's stuff they need, right? That's an area they need to improve. You saw some of that from Jarion as well. You like the kinds of players that they're adding to the secondary. You just question the overall upside of the secondary, right? Because it feels like a lot of players kind of slot in towards average. And maybe you can say the same about Eric Murray here. You look across the board, everything's like slightly above 60 for the important grades. Obviously, we're not too focused on pass rush as a safety. But Eric Murray does bring in someone who has played a lot of snaps, had a lot of time in his career, has been reliable, and is going to give you a floor at that position, which is what a lot of these signings are, right? They're floor signings. They're setting the bar for this team to where you're thinking you can't lose 13 games again this year. It's kind of the idea behind so much of this. Now, as for the last couple guys here, we have another tight end who is not listed on here just because I don't have the contract yet. I think it's $5 million over 2 years with Hunter Long. He was someone they were saying was hurt a lot of his time in Los Angeles, just had a lot of things kind of pop up that derailed some of his development, but he was someone they had some confidence in. Johnny Munt was someone who was familiar in the offense of Grant Udinsky, so there's value there. You also say the same for Nick Mullins. A lot of what I remember from Nick Mullins watching him, I think it was 2023 season primarily, because we've got some Vikings fans in the family, so we check out some of their games here and there. Very aggressive player, right? He's going to make big throws. He's going to throw some interceptions doing that. He's also going to throw some touchdowns. So he'll get the ball moving for an offense if he has to go in. He's just not going to keep it clean too much of the time. But Johnny Munt and Hunter Long, they're going to be blockers. They're going to be good in that role. Munt is a capable receiver as well. I think he's a nice tight end too. I won't call him too much more than that, but it does give you depth of the position to where you don't really have to go into the draft and say, we have to pick another guy at this position. I would like to in a strong draft. I think there's going to be opportunities all the way into round 7 and maybe even undrafted free agency. Um, but that's kind of where things sit there. So, I mean, you look at the depth chart, it's a solid room with Brendan Strange, Johnny Munt, and Hunter Long. Now, here's kind of the big conversation as far as where this roster is right now, and then we'll talk about the cap right at the very end of this. But you look across the board. This is my concern for this team right now, and why I would be interested in the draft and just trying to take players that are true difference makers. And that could mean drafting a superstar at safety over an average player that plays defensive end, right? I think we need legitimate star talent on this team. Because you go across the board. I mean, Brian Thomas Jr., we know what he is. Trevor Lawrence, you want to believe. But the running back room, not much there. Brown in Washington, Davis, you're not going to say it's there. Strange, no. The offensive line, you've got upside, but you don't have some dominant player on this line, right? It's no superstar. Joshua Hines-Allen, kind of the second tier of pass rushers at this point, unfortunately. Not that he can't jump back up into that top tier like he did in 2023. That's sort of what he is right now, though. Traylon Walker's somewhere around there as well. Would not call anyone on this defensive line a superstar. I think the linebacker position, you have some really good players. Would not say there's a superstar. And the secondary, the closest you get to it is Tyson Campbell. And he's hurt quite a bit for this team. So, who are the superstars on this player? On this team? Who are the guys you're going to think of when you think of the Jacksonville Jaguars? Well, it is Trevor Lawrence and Brian Thomas Jr. That's kind of it at this point. So to me, when I'm thinking about the draft and what you want to do with it, look, you've addressed a lot of needs for this team. You know, if I'm going to bring up what they're missing, a lot of it's talking about rotational stuff, right? It's going to be, hey, we need an air pass rusher in this mix because, just realized, let's pretend we don't see Roy Robertson Harris here because he is not actively on the team. But you don't have much there, right? Like you've got Yasir Abdullah and Miles Cole, and those players are not stopping you from getting someone else to come in and take those snaps. And if you're going to have JHA and Walker out there on 800 snaps this year, you got another 800 to go with someone else. Or you could increase their workload perhaps. But you're going to have a lot of snaps that need to get filled. You have to bring someone else in there. The linebacker room, I think you could look at adding an air player there. You're going to have some people who might be leaving eventually. Devin Lloyd could be on his final season. Chad Muma, he will be going into his final season. You know, there's going to be some change that could take place. And I think it's the last year guaranteed for Aluakon as well. Aside from that, wide receiver, you do need depth there, right? Tight end, you could add another player, but you need superstars, right? You want top tier players. And so it would be in the cards for me to get aggressive, to look more so for quality of picks rather than quantity. And man, I mean, I saw the idea floated out today on Twitter, but if you had to, and the option was on the table, you could almost think about trading up for Travis Hunt if you have to. And I know that people are probably not thinking about trading up if you're the Jaguars, right? You're thinking about maybe your opportunities to move back. Maybe number 10 with the Bears if they want to come up for Ashton Genty. Things like that. You could also be the team that drafts an Ashton Genty. We need to get superstar players onto this roster to really change the way things are going, so people are going to make plays, we're going to win the games for this team, and you're going to think of when you think of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So I want to see this team get aggressive. I want to see them getting those types of guys. And if they can do that, then I'm going to feel a lot better about where they are right now. Because if I do look at this roster, yes, they'll have better coaching. Yes, there are some improvements. I think this is still a roster that's probably around 9-8 that's trying to compete for a playoff spot. It could be more. it's hard for me to say that without being a little bit of a fan in my evaluation. Now, the final thing we'll talk about here really quick, as far as the spending for this team. After this year, there's going to be $147 million that are pushed to 2026 and beyond. These will be numbers that go against the cap figures that are going to be money that was spent on previous years. So there's a fair amount of money this team has pushed down the road. Did it get much worse? Not really. This is similar to what we had last year. So you're not really improving. You're not really getting worse. And you see, with the spending on these contracts, the average value of these deals that they have for this roster, it adds up, right? I mean, you're right there with what the cap is for this team, because we're going to compare the average value of these contracts to what the teams are being given in salary cap. Not talking about rollover or any of that, but just what are you being given to spend and how much are you really spending on the players at the end of the day. So they don't really go into this saving. They don't really go into it overspending. They're setting the floor. It costs them a decent amount. It was maybe a little too expensive for what I would have liked for what they got done. But ultimately, it's going to allow them flexibility in the draft. It's going to allow them to make moves. And hopefully they can come out of it with some great football players. So, with that said, that is going to wrap this up here. That's kind of all we got. I just wanted to have a video come out to really talk about all this, especially since we haven't had a lot of signings. Signings since Monday. We didn't get to really finish our thoughts on the day. So I figured we'd put this out and talk about it. So with that said, I do want to shout out our channel members, Premier Nasir 904, Nightmare Eco, Hater John Bites, Ichi Wiener, Mr. Dolphin, Scrubber Ducky 500, Brian Foster, and Frangies. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel through all this. Appreciate you guys. If you guys got any thoughts on the signings for this team, what you think of it, let me know in the comments. I'll make sure to get back with you. But that's all I got. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.